This looks like your normal Gram, a sweet old lady who would bake you cookies. She would pass out Werther's Originals to all the neighbor kids, and she looks like she would crochet you a blanket. Well, she's also affectionately known as the Death Row Granny. Hello, true crimerers, Facebook people. This is the case of Velma Barfield. Viewer discretion is advised. Velma Barfield, she was born on October 29th, 1932, back when I was in my early 90s. She was born Margie Velma Bullard, and she was raised in the Fayetteville, North Carolina area. She had a bit of a history with family being, issues. Her dad, was physically abusive towards her, and he would mentally abuse her, and also her mom. She also had siblings, and they kind of got a bit of the brunt as well. Not a great start for Velma's life. When Velma was about 16 years old, she just wanted to get away from that life. Understandably. She met an older man named Thomas Burke, and they got married pretty quickly. She was about 17 years old when they got married, and that basically meant she could move out of the house and not be near her father anymore. Initially, the relationship/marriage started off wonderfully. They would end up having 2 kids together, and it just seemed like your perfect little happy family. And then Velma suffered like a minor back injury. She also had to get a hysterectomy, and she started taking painkillers. And Velma got hooked. She became addicted to painkillers, and she started taking them a lot. Thomas would eventually start drinking because Velma was becoming, a lot. This then led to turmoil in their relationship, marriage. They were always arguing and fighting. On April 4th, 1969, Velma, after a big old fight with Thomas, she took the 2 kids out of the house, and they just sort of went somewhere. They just needed to get away from Thomas for a little bit. When they got back, the house was on fire, completely engulfed in flames. Later on, they would find the body of Thomas Burke. Tragic accident. Velma is so sad and devastated. Well, for like a couple days or so, she meets another man very soon afterwards in 1970. His name was Jennings Barfield. They got married hella quick, and that's where Velma would get her forever last name. Well, on March 22nd, 1971, Jennings was found dead. They would determine at first that it was a heart attack. Something happened with his heart, and he just died. It would be found out later that Velma and Jennings were going through some arguments because Velma was still going on with her painkiller addiction, and this really upset Jennings. They fought all the time about it. And then he winds up dead. Second husband to die. He was feeling pretty sick before his death, complaining a lot of chest pains, a lot of burning feelings in his stomach. He was vomiting, which they just sort of concluded was his heart was failing. Velma moved on again very quickly. She found herself a new boyfriend. That wouldn't last long, and luckily this guy got to survive. She would move back in with her parents in North Carolina, but then in 1974, Velma's mom, Lillian, she all of a sudden just had a crazy sickness. She was vomiting. She had a lot of diarrhea. She had that burning feeling in her stomach like it was on fire. A lot of chest pains. Didn't know where it was coming from. She went to the doctor. They said they really couldn't figure it out, but it'll probably go away on its own, and it did. And then, towards the end of that same year, Lillian got sick again with all the same symptoms. This time, she died. Now, it should also be noted that her father also had issues with this sort of random sickness, but he also was battling lung cancer, and eventually the lung cancer is what actually killed him. Velma started dating someone else, and then shortly into that, Velma was caught writing bad checks on his on his checks. And she did it like many times. And she was caught for it, and she was charged and put in prison. She was sentenced to like 6 to 8 months, but she only actually served 3. And then in 1976, Velma, she needs money. She needs to make an income. So she started doing caretaker work for older couples. This is when she would meet Montgomery and Dolly Edwards. This was in Lumberton, North Carolina. Now, Montgomery was in his 80s. He really wasn't mobile. He was bedridden kind of anyway, but he never had issues with like getting really, really sick until January of 1977 when he fell ill with a mysterious illness with vomiting, diarrhea, severe burning in his stomach, chest pains, headaches, and then on January 29th, 1977, he died. Dolly was a little bit younger. She could walk around the house, but she wasn't super mobile either. From what I understand, she noticed that some checks were being written as well, and she suspected possibly that Velma was doing something nefarious. It sounded like she also was kind of questioning like her care of her husband and what led to his death. And then Dolly got really, really sick. And about a month after her husband died, Dolly too died after suffering from vomiting, diarrhea, stomach burning, chest pains, headaches. Then in 1978, she got herself another caretaker job. This was for 76-year-old Record Lee and her husband, John Henry Lee. And then John Henry started getting sick. We've been down this road, folks. What do you get sick with? Diarrhea, vomiting, severe stomach burning, chest pains, headache, beep, boop, boop. And then he would die. Now, is anyone really making connections at this point? Kind of not really, because Velma at this point with these two couples are like kind of on her own. There was some suspicions, however, early on when her first husband died and then her second husband died. And then, her mom died. And so it was like, this is kind of weird. They're all dying of very similar things, but no one really put it together, like, in terms of calling the police or anything. And then Velma found love again. Aww. Oh, no. She would meet a man named Roland Stewart Taylor. He would go by Stewart. Velma was up to her old tricks again. She started writing checks. Bad checks with his checks, and he was catching on. It sounded like he was going to confront her when he got very, very sick. Yeah, violently ill. On February 3rd, 1978, Stewart Taylor died. Now, at this point, no one had really done thorough autopsies in terms of like toxicology reports, right? It would later be Velma's sister who would call police after basically having her own, I guess, suspicion sort of quietly on for a little while. She called police after Stewart's death and said, listen, I think my sister is doing this because my mother died under very similar circumstances, as did 2 of her husbands, and now there's a 4th person who seems to have died virtually the same way. So they do a toxicology report on Stewart Taylor. They find very high levels of arsenic and rat poison in his system. The symptoms of which all of these victims had experienced, minus the husband that died in the fire. I just realized that I think I had just said that the first husband died under the same circumstances. He didn't. Obviously, I said earlier that he died in a fire. My apologies. But the other individuals linked to Velma, well, they all died with the same symptoms. Essentially, the theory now was Velma is this serial killer who basically, according to like interviews with her sister and other people in her life, Velma is someone who needed to control every single situation. So like basically when it came down to like the motive, if anyone was to throw her off her plans, if anyone was to try to tell on her, if anyone interrupted this bubble she put herself in, if anyone popped that bubble of like, I'm controlling all of this and this is all about me, well, they would die for it, basically. Sounds like there were probably a couple people in her life, though, that were lucky to survive. Velma would be arrested for the now murder of Stewart Taylor. She would go on trial for his murder, and she would be convicted, and she was sentenced to death. In terms of the other 6 people who died under mysterious circumstances in her life, the husband who died in the fire, the second husband who died from a sickness, the mother died of a sickness, the first 2 people she was caretaking for died of mysterious illness, then another person under a caretaker situation died of a mysterious illness. None of them went to trial. She wasn't charged formally with any of those murders. Because she had already been convicted of Taylor's death and sentenced to death, there really wasn't a necessity to continue going on. I don't know if they exhumed any bodies. She would confess to not only Stuart Taylor's death, but she confessed to 3 more. So there are a couple out there that she did not actually confess to. So they are still pretty certain that she likely committed all of these murders. And while awaiting her sentence on death row, she became known as the Death Row Granny. Even though by the time she would eventually be executed, she was only 52. She really wasn't even that old. She apparently claimed to find God on death row, and she allegedly changed her life around, and she became a much better person. And she was all this, sugar and spice and everything nice. And even Billy Graham himself praised Velma for her work, basically, because she would preach to other people in the prison, and he would say, "Good job, Velma. Despite the fact that you are on death row for murdering someone and possibly killed 6 other people, you did." On November 2nd, 1984, at the age of 52, she was executed by lethal injection. Her final words were, "I know that everyone has gone through a lot of pain, all the families connected, and I am sorry. And I want to thank everyone who has been supporting me all of these years." Her final meal? Cheese doodles and a Coke. May she be crocheting in hell for eternity. And that is it, True Crime Aroonies. And as I always close out every video, I'm going to sniff both these markers and see if there's a difference between red smell and pink smell. A nanny would stab 2 children to death, and to this day, no one really knows why. Hello, true face crimerers. This is the case of the Krim siblings. Viewer discretion is advised. Marina and Kevin Krim, they lived in the New York City area, specifically in Manhattan. The 2 of them had 3 wonderful children together. Marina had been a teacher for many years, but then eventually, I guess she would transition to being more of a stay-at-home mom. Kevin actually worked for CNBC, I guess in the digital content area of the network. Their 3 children were 2-year-old Leo, 6-year-old Lucia, who would go by Lulu, and they also had a 3-year-old girl named Nessie. The family, they did still have kind of a busy life, and so they did employ a nanny, and her name was Yoselin Ortega. Yoselin had been from the Dominican Republic. She moved to the States around 2002 or so, and she did become a naturalized U.S. citizen. Yoselin had a 17-year-old son, and she lived kind of near the Krims in Manhattan with her sister and also her niece and her son. The Krim family lived in the La Rochelle Apartments, which was in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. On October 25th, 2012, Marina had been out with her daughter Nessie. She had been doing a swimming lesson, I guess, at the YMCA. And right after that, she was to go to a ballet recital for little Lulu. Yoselin was supposed to meet Marina at the ballet recital with Lulu and Leo, but Yoselin and the kids weren't there. So right around 5:30 p.m., Marina gets back to the apartment, and it's completely dark inside. She kind of calls out for people's names. She doesn't hear anything. So she thinks that no one's there. So she goes downstairs. She talks to the doorman at the building, and he says that actually Jocelyn and the two kids had just gotten home a little bit before Marina had gotten there. So Marina is like, okay, and she goes back upstairs, and she walks kind of farther into the apartment, and turns into the darkened bathroom. And in the bathtub, she sees a nightmare, something that no parent should ever, ever have to see. Leo and Lucia were in the bathtub. The bathtub was full of blood. Blood was all over the bathroom. They had both been stabbed. Jocelyn was in the bathroom lying next to the tub, I guess, crying. And when Marina walked in, Jocelyn freaked out, and she cut her own wrists right there and then started to stab herself in the neck repeatedly. Marina, I mean, this is just a nightmare of a scene. Like, this is all happening within moments. And I can't even imagine what that has to even be like for this poor mother who had to, like, see all of this. But obviously they call 911, the ambulance gets there, and unfortunately both children are pronounced dead at the scene. They had both been stabbed just many times apiece. It was violent, it was insane, and it was very clear that Jocelyn had done this. Jocelyn, who also suffered from numerous self-inflicted stab wounds, well, she actually survived. They were able to kind of nurse her back to health, nurse her back to life. When she was back to health, she was promptly arrested. Lucia, the 6-year-old girl, she had stab wounds in her hands. She was trying to fight off Jocelyn. Jocelyn would later say that Leo was asleep when she started stabbing him, and that he really never woke up. Initially, Jocelyn's attorneys would say, "Well, clearly she's insane. She's too mentally unstable. She shouldn't even have to go to trial." Like, no, she was actually looked at by numerous psychologists before a trial would take place. All of the psychologists said, actually, she is well within her mental realm of normalcy. She is not mentally incompetent. Not enough to stand trial, so she would stand trial. They tried to offer her a plea deal of 30 years to life. She said, "Nope, I want to go to trial. I want to try to get off on insanity." And that's what they pled in court, was not guilty by reason of insanity. But why would she do it? Why would she kill these two innocent children? That is really still not known. One of the reasons they are just sort of came up with was that Jocelyn was unhappy with what she was getting paid. She was apparently being paid $18 an hour to nanny the kids. And according to Jocelyn, the two parents had asked her to do more than just nannying, like cleaning up around the house. And Jocelyn claims she asked for more money and claims that Marina had said no, but there really was no validity to that. There was not much truth to it. She, I think, it sounds like, was just upset that she wasn't getting paid what she wanted to get paid. I guess took it out on the two kids for some evil reason. Because when family and friends would sort of go on the stand, they would say that Marina and her husband treated Jocelyn wonderfully. That they even paid for Jocelyn to go back to the Dominican Republic to visit her family. They paid for her entire trip. Twice. And they actually, on one of those occasions, they went on vacation with her to meet her family. They did a lot for her. And yet she still complained that she wasn't getting enough. And then I guess she needed to murder the kids out of anger for that. At trial, again, she would try to plead that she was just crazy. She didn't know what she was doing. Everyone knows she did it. Even the defense is like, yeah, she did this, but she wasn't in her right mind. But they weren't able to prove that. They brought up many experts, psychologists and whatnot, who said There's no indication that she was psychotic or mentally unstable. She did have issues in her life with depression, anxiety, severe issues with those things, and she was never properly treated for them. She never really got help, and no one ever got help for her. But those aren't issues that necessarily will justify murdering 2 children. And the jury would agree with that. And they found her very much guilty on both counts of murder. And she would end up being sentenced to life in prison without parole. She could have taken a 30-year to life sentence, but she decided to roll the dice and she lost. The parents then got up in court during her sentencing. They had a few choice words for her. Mainly, they looked her right in the face and just called her evil. But she was pure evil. And there's no more accurate statement than that. Because anyone who does that to 2 kids, you're not... I don't have words. It's so maddening to me that people are capable of doing this to children. To a 2-year-old boy, a 6-year-old girl. You stabbed them to death. Apparently, I guess it would come out that Jocelyn had documented mental health issues, like I had said earlier, but she never disclosed that information to the Krims. The Krims likely would not have hired her had she disclosed this information. As parents, I'm sure they would have wanted to hire someone to look after their very young children who isn't, battling mental health issues. They obviously couldn't foresee, even if they did know that, couldn't necessarily foresee this happening. But I also understand why you'd want to know this information ahead of time. But she lied and she never told them. So New York would end up passing Lulu and Leo's law. Basically where it's now a crime to knowingly misrepresent yourself or your qualifications while applying for work to, work with kids, to be a nanny, to be a caregiver, that kind of thing. But Jocelyn, who was 50 years old at the time of this anyway, she can rot away in her prison cell for the rest of her life. And I hope it sucks. I hope it sucks for her. People in jail don't take so kindly to child killers, nor should they. But that is it for this case. True crime maroony deeny doo 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 ding dong de dong de dongs. That was vomit. So until then, true crime maroonies. Excuse me, I have a call. Hi. Yeah. This is personal. Can you leave? Thank you. Those guys are crazy, right? Oh, they're unstable.
Became one soul.
Became one soul. What does that mean?
No questions now. Please, till sure met, search no more. Blessings are near.
Do not kill my daughter, please. I mean,
We
please.
love and miss y'all. Get good
Let me-
rest tonight. Goodbye.
Wait a minute. He's gone, Mom.
A man would taunt a family with some disturbing phone calls about their missing daughter. And she wasn't the only victim. Hello, true-faced crimerers. This is the case of Shari Smith and Deborah May Helmick. Viewer discretion is advised. Sharon Smith, who would go by Shari to all of her friends and family, she was born to Hilda and Bob Smith on June 25th, 1967, and the family lived in Columbia, South Carolina. Shari had an older sister named Dawn and a younger brother named Robert Jr. The Smith family was really well known in this particular community. They were highly regarded. They were a pillar of the community. They were very involved in the church in that area, and they were considered a very influential family as well. Shari, growing up, she was always described as sort of like the life of the party, even at a young age. Very bubbly personality. She was very outgoing. Didn't seem to be afraid of much. She was highly intelligent. She always got fantastic grades throughout school. And her friends and family would say that she was the type of person that if you were in a really, really bad mood, no matter what mood she was in, she could do something to make you feel better. Shari was really close with her entire family. She had very loving parents, loving siblings. They all got along. There was never turmoil in the family, nothing out of the ordinary. And then May 31st, 1985 came along. Shari had just finally graduated from high school at Lexington High School. Her graduation ceremony was in a couple of days. She, who I guess was a pretty good singer, was tapped to sing the national anthem at the graduation ceremony. And then after graduation, she and a whole bunch of her classmates had booked a really awesome vacation to take. It was going to be a cruise, but unfortunately, Shari never got to board that cruise. On that afternoon, May 31st, 1985, at approximately 3:30 p.m., Shari had driven back to her house. She had been spending the afternoon with friends at a pool party, just swimming and having a good time. She pulled up to the property and stopped her vehicle at the family's mailbox. The mailbox was roughly 700 to 800 feet away from the front door of the house. So it was a really long, driveway. She got out of the car, she opened up the mailbox and got the mail out. Her dad actually could see her car from the window, and then he kind of walked away from the window, fully expecting that she would be at the front door any second now because it's right there, right? She never got to the front door. And when he peered out the window again, he still saw her car by the mailbox, but couldn't see Shari. And so, growing concerned, he basically bolted his way up to the mailbox. Shari's car was there. One of the doors was still open. Her purse was sitting on the passenger side of the car, and the mailbox was opened, and the mail was scattered all over the ground. There appeared to be shoe prints in the dirt as well. Not very clear shoe prints, but it looked like they were shoes that were bigger in size than Shari's. And the shoe impressions were actually walking away from the car, but there weren't really any coming towards the car. Her dad is obviously freaking out, where the hell did she go? And he's looking all over the area. He's screaming her name. Nothing. And he waits several more minutes. There's no sign of her. So he runs back to the house. He's panicking, of course, and he calls 911. Says, I think my daughter may have just been taken. And so police arrive at the property pretty quickly, and they assess the scene of the car and the mailbox, and they kind of agree it does appear that something happened here where Shari was likely abducted. So the police, along with the family, along with a whole bunch of volunteers, this became, at the time, the largest manhunt in South Carolina's history. I mean, they got everybody involved looking for Shari Smith. Little did the family know that their horror was about to get even worse. The Smith phone would ring, and when they answered, there was a distorted voice of a man on the other end saying he was the one to take Shari. To prove he was the one to take Shari, he told Shari's mom on the phone she was wearing a black and yellow swimsuit underneath her clothes that day. And in fact, her mom knew that she was. He tells them that Shari is doing well. She is sitting in my living room eating dinner and watching TV, but he did not allow the parents to hear her voice or confirm she was alive still. He wasn't even asking for money, as at first police were like, this is an influential family, they have a lot of pull here. Clearly this person was abducted and they're going to demand money, but the guy never did. The man then told them to be on the lookout for a letter that Shari was going to be giving them. The guy hung up, the family called police, let him know what just happened. The police are able to trace the phone number to a payphone near a drugstore about 20 miles or so away from the Smith house. But they don't know who made the phone call. Sure enough, the following morning at the family's mailbox, there was a single letter inside. It was addressed to the Smith family. They opened up the envelope and pulled out a 2-page letter that was written in what definitely appeared to be Shari's handwriting, and I believe later confirmed to be her handwriting. What's very concerning about this letter is the opening line of this was the last will and testament. The letter would be Shari saying how much she loved her family, to please not worry about her anymore. She'll soon be, in a better place. And one of the most haunting aspects of it is she had written in the letter, closed casket. Meaning, she was aware that she was about to be killed, and it was going to be so bad that she needed to be in a closed casket at her own funeral. This absolutely horrified the family. They gave the letter, of course, to the police with the envelope. They tested it for all sorts of stuff, fingerprints, any kind of potential DNA, even though it wasn't really a thing yet back then, but they kind of knew about its existence, but they just checked it for everything. The letter itself did not yield any actual physical evidence, however. And there was no return address, and they don't know where it came from. And then that afternoon, the family got a phone call again. This time, police had set the family's phone up with a recording device. And so what you're about to hear is the actual recorded phone call that man made.
Have you received the mail today?
Yes, I have.
Do you believe me now?
Well, I'm not really sure I believe you because I haven't had any word from Shari. And I need to know that Shari is well.
You'll know in 2 or 3 days.
Why 2 or 3 days?
Call the search off.
Later that exact same night, they got another phone call.
I want to tell you one other thing. Shari is now part of me. Physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, our souls are one now.
I think one of the phone calls came from that same payphone when I guess nobody was watching it. And then other times, the phone calls were coming from a number they couldn't trace. They didn't have as extensive technology as we obviously have now, back in 1985. The following day is June 4th. They get another phone call. The caller is now wanting to speak to her mom and Shari's sister.
Okay, 4:58 a.m. No, I'm sorry, hold on a minute. 3:10 a.m. Saturday, the 1st of June. She handwrote what you received. 4:58 a.m. Saturday, the 1st of June.
Okay, Saturday, the 1st of June, 4:58 a.m.
Became one soul.
Became one soul.
What does that mean?
No questions now. Please, to assure Smiths, search no more. Blessings are near.
Do not kill my daughter, please. I mean,
We
please.
love and miss y'all. Get good
Let me-
rest tonight. Goodbye.
Wait a minute.
He's gone, Mom.
The next day, June 5th, they get one more phone call from the man, and this is what he says.
Hello?
Listen carefully. Take Highway 378 west to Traffic Circle. Take Prosperity exit. Go 1.5 miles. Turn right at sign. Moose Lodge number 103. Go 1/4 mile. Turn left at white frame building. Go to backyard. 6 feet beyond. We're waiting. God chose us.
He had given the family directions on where to find Shari. Police go to the location to exactly where he says. It's in Saluda County. There's this big white home, and behind that building is a lot of brush, a lot of wooded areas, and sure enough, about 6 to 8 feet into that foresty area is Shari. It is her body. Her body was beginning to decompose, and they determined that she had actually been dead for a few days, so that during all of these phone calls, Shari was likely already dead. They did confirm that Shari was alive when she wrote that letter, which was likely written the day of or the next day of her kidnapping, and then she was probably killed at 4:58 a.m., which is when he said that time earlier about how, he and she, her souls had become one, or whatever creepy thing he said. They could not determine her cause of death for certain, but they do believe that she died of asphyxiation or suffocation because she had duct tape residue around her mouth and kind of over her nose. The duct tape itself was gone. They believe he took it off. The killer took it off because he didn't want to leave any trace of him behind for them to find. And basically, he did a good job at that because there were no traces of anything left on her or near her body that they could take and go, okay, this is going to link to someone. There was no physical evidence left behind. They also could not say for certain if she had been sexually assaulted or not. The man didn't stop calling. He called the family again. He wanted to talk to, the sister, Dawn. And he told her at one point, I'm planning on turning myself in soon. Don't worry. He never did. He also called the family the night of Shari's funeral to kind of just sort of taunt them some more. Again, they're not able to trace these calls at all. He told them that God was ready to accept her as an angel. Sometime later, and we're talking like weeks or maybe even a month or two later, the man calls the family again. But this time he has nothing to say about Shari. He's now telling the Smith family about someone else. And he gives them these directions.
Have you heard about Deborah May Hamrick?
No.
The 10-year-old? Helmick?
Richland County?
Yeah?
Uh-huh.
Okay, listen carefully. Turn right. Last dirt road before you come to stop sign at 2 Notch Road. Go due chain and no trespassing sign. Go 50 yards. And to the left, go 10 yards. Deborah May is waiting. God forgive us all.
2 weeks after Shari Smith was kidnapped and eventually killed, a very young girl, 10-year-old girl named Deborah May Helmick, was playing outside of her family's trailer home. This is about 24 miles or so away from the Smith family. Deborah lived with her family in Richland County. So Deborah was out there playing. Her father was literally like 15 feet from her, kind of, I guess, around the corner, but he can kind of still see her. Like, he was outside with her. When all of a sudden a car speeds up to where Deborah is, a man reaches over and pulls her into the car and speeds off. And this happens within moments. There's no, like, he couldn't react. Like, the dad was like, what the just happened? And a neighbor saw it too, and like, they immediately called police. Like, my daughter was just kidnapped right in front of me. And, for weeks, they had no leads. This family didn't get phone calls or anything like that. There was no letters given. This was just a 10-year-old girl was just stolen. And nobody knew why, and nobody knew who did it. And then the Smith family gets that phone call directing them where to find Deborah May. And when police arrive, they do, in fact, find her body. And she is deceased. Again, unfortunately, no physical evidence was left behind, and they couldn't necessarily tell the cause of death, but they believe, again, was some kind of suffocation. The Smith family got more phone calls. This guy was taunting the family still. He was asking if Dawn wanted to join Shari, where she is now, implying that, he may want to find her and kill her too. He even said, God wants you to join Shari now. He kept bringing God into the conversation. So, police are having a hell of a time tracing this guy, where he's calling from. And then they think of something pretty brilliant. The last will and testament that was written by Shari that the Smith family got. Well, the police and the FBI, they took the 2 sheets of paper and they did a whole bunch of smart people stuff with it. I can't even begin to explain it, but basically it's kind of like that old thing where you would take a blank, the blank piece of paper, and you would do the pencil and would lift up some writing. Well, they took that letter that Shari had written. They were able, unbelievably, to pull off, with a lot of science stuff, not just a pencil and paper, were able to basically pull up information that they could say for certain was written on the piece of paper before Sherry's letter. So whatever the person was writing on that notepad, because it was written on some kind of notepad, I think. So that whatever was written before it had imprinted itself, to the paper below it, which is the paper that eventually Shari would use to write that letter. From that, they got like these weird, looks like some segments of like a bill was being paid. They got something like possibly a grocery list was written. It wasn't all totally easy to make out, but they got some information from it. But most importantly, they got a phone number from it. There was a phone number written on this piece of paper. They looked up the phone number and they discovered that it belonged to a couple. Specifically, the home was owned by a man named Ellis Shepard. And so police were able to determine that they basically looked further into phone records, and I guess at this point now they're able to determine that that phone number is the phone number that was sometimes calling the Smith family. And so they determined that those phone calls were coming from Ellis Shepard's home. But was Ellis Shepard the killer? No. Ellis Shepard and his wife, during the entire time that Shari had been kidnapped and killed, and then Deborah had been kidnapped and killed, they were on vacation way far away, which police confirmed without a shadow of a doubt. But then they asked this couple if they could listen to the voice of the man who made these phone calls. And immediately, Ellis Shepard was like, that son of a bitch, that dirty son of a bitch, I know who that is. And he gave police a name, and it would be the name of their killer, Larry Gene Bell. Larry Gene Bell had done work at that house for that family. And while they were on vacation, they had Larry Gene Bell house sitting for them. So that is where Larry Gene Bell was for that entire period, where he was making those phone calls from. And they determined by finding pieces of evidence at the house, including some blonde hair, that they would confirm were nearly identical to those from Shari Smith. So, they also found the notepad. They found the actual notepad, and they lined it up with the letter and all their testing, and they confirmed that this was the notepad that was used to write that letter. So they know that Shari was in this house. She wrote the letter in that home. They found her hairs. This is likely where Shari was murdered. Larry Gene Bell was born and grew up in Ralph, Alabama, and he was born on October 30th, 1949. He was one of 5 kids. From what I understand, there's not a whole lot of information on him, but he had a relatively normal upbringing, nothing too crazy. The family did bounce around a lot from state to state, eventually settling in South Carolina. He would go on to graduate high school. He went on to a trade school. He became an electrician. He got married. He had a kid. In the 70s, he joined the Marines. He was discharged because he accidentally shot himself in the kneecap. So he was like, all right, you gotta go, bud. He even worked for the Department of Corrections for quite some time. They also found out that during the mid to late 70s, Larry Gene Bell had been convicted of attempting to kidnap 3 women. And unbelievably, our justice system, so great. He only got 3 years in prison total for attempting to kidnap 3 women. His life fell apart during the 70s. His wife divorced him, took their kid away from him. Police would bring him in for questioning. He initially denied everything, and then they also spoke again to the gentleman whose house he was house sitting for. That gentleman said that Larry Gene Bell, when they got back into town, Larry Gene Bell picked him and his wife up from the airport. And all Larry Gene Bell could do the entire ride home was talk about the kidnapping of Shari Smith. They thought it was very strange, but they also saw it as he just wanted to fill them in on what was happening in their community. So even though at first Larry was denying he did anything, he then kind of switched his tune and said, well, good Larry Bell didn't commit those 2 murders, but bad Larry Bell, he may have done it. Okay, probably trying to put on some sort of insanity defense, but it wouldn't work. So he was arrested and charged with multiple counts, kidnapping and murder for both victims. He went on trial in February of 1986, and the jury deliberated for less than an hour, and they came back with guilty for the murder of Shari Smith, and then he was sentenced to death. Then he went on trial again for Deborah Helmick, and once again they deliberated for about an hour when they came back with the verdict of guilty and sentencing you to death again. This is during a time in South Carolina when a person could choose how they wanted to be executed. They were given two choices, lethal injection or the electric chair. He chose the electric chair. Not sure I would have chosen that one. On October 4th, 1996, about 10 years or so after he was convicted for the murders of Shari Smith and Deborah Helmick, Larry Gene Bell was placed in the electric chair. They threw the switch and they fried the son of a bitch out of existence. Authorities believe he may be responsible for even more disappearances and possible murders. There were a couple of women, Sandy Cornett and Denise Porch. They had gone missing in South Carolina in kind of the same time frame, and they have never been found. But they also have never found proof that he was involved in their disappearances at all. They just speculate he may likely have been involved. Shari Smith was a 17-year-old girl on the verge of just beginning her life. She was so excited to graduate high school. She was so excited for this cruise. But Larry Gene Bell decided that he needed to take her away from the world instead. And Shari Smith never got a chance to experience life. Deborah Helmick was just a 10-year-old child. She was just playing right outside of her house, right in front of her dad. And she was just taken in an instant. She never even got to go to junior high, let alone high school. That afternoon, she probably just wanted to go inside and watch cartoons, like any child would want to do. But Larry Gene Bell took that away from the world as well. And for what it's worth, I hope Larry Gene Bell is stewing in a pot of boiling lava there down in the lowest depths of hell. And I'll gladly say that with a smile on my face. But that is it for this case, True Crime Maroonies. I hope you found it interesting. Hello, True Face Crimerers. This is the case of Orion Krause. Viewer discretion is advised. 22-year-old Orion Krause was considered, I guess, a musician in the making, maybe. He loved performing music, playing instruments, singing, and at the time of this particular case, he is living in Rockport, Maine. On September 8th, 2017, Orion was, I guess, in is it Groton, Massachusetts, or Groton, Massachusetts? I'm not sure. But that is where his mother and his grandparents lived. His mother, 60-year-old Elizabeth Krause, lived with her parents, 89-year-old Frank Lackey and 85-year-old Elizabeth Lackey. Because of their age and some medical issues that they had, they also had a medical aide staying there on the property with them. And that was 68-year-old Bertha May Parker. It was just before 6 p.m. that day, on September 8th, 2017, when 911 received a phone call. The gentleman who called said that there was a young man who was identifying himself as Orion Krause sitting on a chair in his yard, stating that he had just murdered 4 people. And obviously this is a huge concern. Police arrive, and when they get to this location, they do in fact find 22-year-old Orion sitting on this outdoor chair. When he gets up, there is blood on the chair. There's blood all over himself. He seems to be mumbling to himself, kind of incoherently, and he does reiterate, "I just killed 4 people." They ask him, well, where did you do this? And he said he pointed kind of down the road and eventually told them it was at his grandparents' house. So the police go down to the grandparents' home. They kind of peer in one of the windows, and sure enough, there is an elderly couple sitting in chairs, basically kind of facing the window. Both of them are in their chairs, blood all over the place, and it looks like their heads have been caved in by something, and they were very clearly deceased. So when they walk into the house cautiously, just in case, they find a third victim. This was Orion's mother. She too had blood all over the place. Her head had also been bashed by some kind of object, and she was very clearly deceased. Police begin to search kind of outside the property, and I guess as they go in the back of the property, they find a blood trail and see another body lying on the ground. And this was the body of the caretaker who was living there. Same thing, she had blood all over her, and her head had apparently been hit by something several times. Police back at the other residence were told that there was confirmation of 4 dead bodies at this other place. So these police put this white sheet around Orion, and they walk him to a police vehicle, and they place him under arrest. Inside, back at the house, I mean, it was an absolute bloodbath. They said there was like blood, like literally 20, 30 feet up. It had very high ceilings, and there was just blood all over the living area, blood all over their kitchen. This was a nightmare. This was a brutal, brutal thing. Police would also recover what they believed was the murder weapon, an aluminum baseball bat that was covered in blood, and eventually Orion would confess to the 4 murders, stating that he did in fact use that metal bat. Rewinding time just a little bit, literally like an hour, hour and a half, about 90 minutes or so before the 911 call was made to report the 4 murders, someone else had called police. It was Orion's, therapist. He had been in contact with Orion literally just moments before the therapist tried warning people, but Orion had told him, I'm about to go kill my grandparents and my mom, and I'm going to take a golf club that's inside my grandparents' garage, and I'm going to use that to bash their heads in. The therapist is like trying to convince him to stop, but the phone disconnects. So the therapist does the right thing. He immediately calls the police, and he immediately calls the numbers he has for Orion's mom. Because of the very short window of time, for whatever reason, the warning isn't received in time, obviously. But this therapist, he tried. I mean, he did everything he could. He did all the right things. He contacted all the right people, but it was he had very little time to really do anything about this. All of this was still very kind of unusual. Like, this came out of nowhere for people who knew Orion. He was considered a very, very talented, jazz drummer, jazz musician. He graduated from the Oberlin Conservatory of Music, which was located in Ohio. He seemed like a pretty down-to-earth, level-headed individual. In terms of if he had any serious mental health issues prior to this, that was at least known, is kind of unclear. They asked him, why did you do this? What prompted this? He's never really given an actual answer, other than, I guess I just snapped that day. I just went crazy, and I can't really explain it. During the initial court proceedings, I guess Orion would say that he went into the garage to grab the golf clubs, but then he saw the baseball bat. By the way, I think I said aluminum bat earlier. It was actually a wooden baseball bat. My apologies. And he thought to himself, well, this is better. So he grabbed it, and then he took some apples, I guess, out in the yard, and he began practice swinging on the apples just to make sure it felt right before going in and doing this. But ultimately, it's really not known why the hell he did this. It could very well be a genuine mental health issue, a very genuine psychotic break. I know a lot of people like to, a lot of these types of criminals like to feign some kind of psychotic break or say, I'm insane, that's why I did it, even though they clearly weren't. This is a situation where it may just be the case. That may just be the reality, that he was just mentally unwell, severely. Eventually, this would not go to an actual jury trial because Orion Krause decided to plead guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder. He pled guilty to avoid going to a trial because the initial charges were first-degree murder. If he was convicted of those, he would have been given life without parole. But because he pled guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder, he was given a sentence of 25 years to life. So he has to serve 25 years before he can ask for parole. Does not mean that he will ever be paroled, and he will be in his 50s before he can ask for it. Hopefully, during that time, he is getting the absolute treatment that he needs, because if he ever is released, he's going to need to be able to prove that he is no longer a danger to society. This was just a senseless, brutal, disturbing, out-of-the-blue homicide of 4 people, 4 older people, defenseless people. His grandparents couldn't fight back. The only one who seemed to try to fight back, or who could fight back, was the caretaker. She apparently tried to grab the bat at one point, but Orion was stronger and able to pull it from her. Then she tried to run, and then he caught up to her outside and hit her over the head. Like, it just seems it's such a cowardice thing. Regardless, just whatever happened, it's sad. But hopefully he is in prison for a very, very, very long time. But that is it for this case. True Crimeroonies. I hope you found it interesting. A mother of two is found brutally beaten to death at a park in New Mexico. Would she ever get justice? Hello, true-faced crimerers. This is the case of Vanessa Tsosi. Viewer discretion is advised. Vanessa Tsosi was a Native American woman who was originally born in Red Valley, Arizona on April 8th, 1988. At some point down the road, she would move to New Mexico, not too far away. And specifically, she was living in Farmington, New Mexico at the time of this story. Vanessa was the middle child of her siblings, and she got along with her siblings. They were like the best of friends. She was someone who absolutely valued family above all else, and this rang especially true to her own two children. She would do anything for her kids. She loved them to the ends of the earth, and they adored her. At the time of this case, she's 29 years old, and she is working at a local high school. But unfortunately, one November evening in 2017, someone would end all of that in a moment. It was early on November 5th, 2017. Police there in Farmington get a plethora of 911 calls that there is a woman who appears to either be deceased or very badly injured at the Brookhaven Park. I guess is this big open kind of park there in the area with like a playground, plenty of places for, people to just hang out and have little birthday parties and whatnot. And it was a really nice park. When police arrived to the scene, they immediately knew that this woman was not just badly injured. She was, in fact, deceased. She was cold to the touch, and so it appeared that she had likely been just sort of lying there dead for at least several hours. This was kind of a thing in the early-ish morning, so people hadn't, been to the park until the sun came up, and that's maybe why no one had noticed. And they're thinking she must have died sometime in the evening. There was, I guess, a jacket placed over her. The jacket was covered in blood. There was blood, spatter kind of all over there. And she was near this, staircase, to the side of a staircase. And she was just sort of just dumped there, it looked like. Blood all over the place. Her pants were removed and kind of thrown to the side. Her shoes were taken off and thrown to the side. And so they do believe that she was likely sexually assaulted. Her shoes didn't really have any blood on them except for one very small spot underneath, on the sole of the shoe. Near where her body was found, they did also find a pretty usable shoe print, which they would soon determine came from an Air Force One shoe. Unfortunately, there was no identification on the woman. She had no wallet on her, there was no purse. They don't know if anything was stolen from her. They can't tell. So what they had to do was they had to put photos of her clothing on Facebook and kind of disperse them throughout the media. And eventually someone would come forward to say that they recognized the shoe, and the way I guess they had shown the shoes on Facebook and throughout the news, they showed the sole of the shoe, and the person who identified them said there was a bloodstain on the sole that they knew for a fact at that point who the shoe belonged to. And that was 29-year-old Vanessa Tsosi. They had not released any specific information about there being blood on the sole of the shoe, but the reason, I believe this was one of her sisters who came forward to ID the clothing items. she said that I guess there was like something wrong with her shoe, Vanessa, that caused her to bleed, like the bottom of her foot to bleed. And this was like days prior. And she was like, yeah, she was, we made a kind of a joke about it. She was like putting blood drops all over the floor because of her shoe was so, it was damaged. But that's how they determined that's who it was. And then they would eventually confirm through IDing the body that it was in fact Vanessa. When they came forward, they told police that Vanessa had been missing for several hours prior, or in the evening prior. That her family didn't know where she was, but there wasn't like enough window of time to like report her missing because it was only a couple of hours. They told the police that Vanessa had been out with a guy, I guess the day prior. They didn't know who he was, but they would eventually find out who it was, and it was a guy named Bruce. When they looked at Bruce, when they brought him in, he had blood on his shoes. Not like a couple drops, nothing like major. And so they asked him, well, why do you got blood on your shoes? And he said, well, me and my brother, we get into fights all the time, and, sometimes we draw blood, and that's why there's blood on my shoe. And I think they would confirm that blood did not belong to Vanessa. And it turns out Bruce and this brother he always got into fights with, I guess they both knew Vanessa, not super well, but they knew her enough to hang out with her. But police were able to eventually rule out Bruce and his brother from having any involvement in Vanessa's murder. So, several days later, after, they're processing all the evidence collected, I believe there was something left behind, like a cigarette or something, that was near the body that they were able to pull DNA from. And then there was also other items there that had DNA near her body that the DNA did not belong to her. They ran this, and they determined that one of the DNA samples belonged to a man named Jimmy. They find Jimmy, they bring him in, they question him, and as they're talking to him, he says, well, me and my friend Eric, we were hanging out near the park the day before Vanessa was found. And then, shortly after Jimmy and Eric got to the park, he told police that that's when Vanessa showed up with another man whose name was Alvin Nelson. Jimmy says that some kind of fight sort of took place between the men, an altercation of some kind, and he ended up getting shoved down. So he said, I'm leaving. Then police track down Eric. They bring him in for questioning. At first he's like, I wasn't at the park. Jimmy's lying. Nope, wasn't me. Wasn't there. Sorry, not your guy. But he then quickly kind of turned around after he was presented with the story that Jimmy had told, and he said he actually witnessed Vanessa being killed. He said Alvin Nelson had brutally beat Vanessa to death. Okay, now we gotta find Alvin then. So where is he? Well, he'll never face justice. Alvin Nelson, I guess shortly after Vanessa's body was found, he ended his own life. The forensic team had determined that there was blood on Vanessa's body that wasn't just hers. They were able to single out some blood that belonged to someone else, but that blood did not match Jimmy, it did not match Eric, it did not match any of the suspects or any of the people they had questioned before. Bruce, no one. The blood did, however, match Alvin Nelson. They believe that he must have been beating her so badly that he began to bleed, which caused him to transfer his own blood to her body. There was no physical evidence to suggest that this Eric person had anything to do with the actual murder. What Alvin's motive was seems to be kind of unclear, or really unclear, and they'll never be able to know for sure because Alvin is dead. But they were never able to lay charges on this Eric person because they had nothing. He told them the story that Alvin had done it. They confirmed it with the blood on her body, and DNA found on cigarettes near her body doesn't prove anything. It just proves that they were at the park. It doesn't prove that Eric or Jimmy or any of them had anything to do with it other than Alvin. So unfortunately, Vanessa Tsosi will never actually get her justice. Her family will never get justice for her because the man who killed her was a coward, didn't want to face up to what he did, and he took his own life. Meanwhile, 2 children are left without a mother. A family is left without a daughter, a sister. Vanessa Tsosi meant so much to so many people, and her life was taken for no apparent reason by a man who was a cowardly piece of crap, and her life was taken in an instant. But at least, I guess, the comforting thing is that he cannot hurt anybody else ever again. And I hope he's rotting in hell. But that is it for this case, True Crime Maroonies. I hope you found it interesting. As usual, if you are seeing me for the first time, hi, I'm Mike. I do tell stories here every Friday on Facebook. I do also tell 4 true crime stories over on my YouTube channel. I do tell one over on Instagram, and then a couple throughout the week, randomly on TikTok. So please feel free to follow and subscribe everywhere. My link tree has all of my links, and it'll be in my bio here on Facebook if you want to follow me everywhere. But I will see you guys next Friday for another true crime story. So until then, True Crime Maroonies, I shall see you when I sees ya. Ta-ta for now.